Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome once again. Today we're continuing on with our James Bond novel review series with Thunderball, a novel with the dubious honour of having been adapted into two separate James Bond films. Thunderball, of course, and Never Say Never Again. Two of my very least favourite films in the whole filmography, so I was very curious to come to Thunderball and see if I was gonna get anything more out of this on the page. Before I jump into talking about Thunderball, I just want to briefly preface this review by saying that this novel has a very complicated history in terms of legalities and authorship and rights and so on, and I feel that that is something to be discussed in another video. But in short, Thunderball started its life as a film treatment that Ian Fleming was co-writing with a few other people, and when the film fell through, Fleming took some of those ideas and made the novel Thunderball. And of course, when the people who he was collaborating with saw this, they were a bit annoyed and took him to court, and there was a whole load of legal entanglements which the series only recently, over 50 years later, kind of freed itself of. I say this because this video is going to be about Thunderball as a novel, as a creative work, and when I refer to the author of that creative work, I will be referring to Ian Fleming, and I'm fully aware that some of the ideas that are in this novel didn't come from him, they came from other people, and as so much of that is kind of unprovable, I don't want to get into a he said kind of thing, except for one particular element, but we'll be coming to that later on. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the story. The first third of Thunderball concerns James Bond being sent to a health clinic after his physical assessment report came back pretty bad, but at 60 cigarettes a day, is it any wonder why? I really like the initial meeting between Bond and M, and actually, you know what, in the whole book series, the Bond-M scenes are probably my favourite passages to read. I mean, M in this particular instance is being so sprightly and vague. He's sort of just talking at Bond, and Bond is really confused, but it all makes sense when M reveals that he went to a health clinic called Shrublands, and now he's hardly drinking or smoking, or, you know, he's eating a lot of muesli and fibre, I guess, so he's feeling great, and Bond is actually really distressed about this. I just kind of love that Bond is like, I understand that you're really healthy and you're probably gonna live a lot longer now that you've had this health epiphany, but still, you know, where are your 100 cigarettes a day and your 5 carafes of wine? And of course, at the clinic, Bond bumps into a Count Leapy, who he recognises as being from a criminal group, and as a result, Leapy tries to kill Bond when he's strapped to a spinal traction machine, as you do. A scene that plays so much better here than in the film, though, I must admit, and Bond's retaliation is to lock Count Leapy in a steam bath, which gives him quite bad burns, and he has to stay in the hospital for a week. As a result of this, Bond has unknowingly caused a slight rumble in the plans of villainous group SPECTRE, introduced here as the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge and Extortion. Now, both Fleming and Kevin McClory, who was one of Fleming's collaborators when Thunderball was movie treatment, both claim to have invented SPECTRE, and I do find it curious that Fleming now has decided that the villains should be a part of this independent organisation rather than just the usual baddies of, you know, Smersh agents, but it certainly moves away from being too politically charged, which is kind of cool. Fleming is so kind of quick to judge people based on their nationalities that I kind of like the idea that SPECTRE is this sort of body not associated with, you know, a flag or a country, but it's its own organisation. Whether it was McClory or Fleming that came up with the idea of the organisation in concept, I think it's fairly certain that Fleming came up with the name, given how prominent the word SPECTRE has been in the previous Bond books. It's not used in conjunction with the SPECTRE organisation that we have here in Thunderball, but it just is a descriptive word. He uses it quite a lot. It's cropped up quite a bit, quite regularly, actually, and the most prominent being that the villain of Diamonds Are Forever has a base in Spectreville, and the decoding machine from Russia with Love was called the Spectre as well. I think it's very clear when reading the series that Fleming has a certain affinity for that particular word, and so it makes perfect sense to me that he would, you know, use that as a name for a criminal organisation, and then come up with the backronym to justify it. Anyway, the chapters introducing us to Spectre and its leader, Ernst Tara Blofeld, are fantastic, but more on that later. The group has secured 2 nuclear bombs and is demanding £100 million ransom be paid, or they will destroy 2 major cities with them. We then have some detail on how they achieve this, and by paying off an Italian Air Force pilot by the name of Petacci, the group secure the bombs. It's at this point in the story that we're introduced to Emilio Largo, who is the point person for this particular operation, and he promptly kills Petacci. In this version, Petacci is just a bit of a doofus and doesn't seem to be fully aware of how serious the business that he's got entangled in really is, and he's kind of making wisecracks and acting like he's meeting up with old friends or something when Largo just comes in and shoots him. Anyway, the bombs are taken aboard Largo's cruiser, the Disco Volante, and Lippe is killed on the order of Blofeld, and the Secret Service launch Operation Thunderball in order to recover the 2 atomic bombs. Bond is back from the clinic at this point, feeling all fresh and rejuvenated, and like M was at the start of the book, and then he hears about the full atomic bomb situation, the Operation Thunderball, and then he's like, right, where are my cigarettes, where's the booze? M has also fallen back into his old habits as a result of the stress, and that ends the first third of the book, and I was kind of looking forward to this whole health kick thing being a recurring character thread for Bond throughout the book. Like, does his change in diet affect how he is on the mission, and does his drinking or lack of smoking affect things out in the field? But no, it's just kind of something for the first third of the story, and that first third does happen to be my favourite part of the book. After that, Bond is sent to Bahamas on a hunch that M has, and he meets with Felix, who is back on CIA business at this point, and he also meets Domino, who is Largo's mistress and sister of Petacci. Bond gains a lot of information from her about Largo once he starts putting 2 and 2 together and following up on clues and the like, and I grew kind of disinterested around this point of the story, I must admit. There's a lot of just kind of hanging around the Bahamas and following up a lead here and there, and Bond is having to build up a case from a starting point of M's hunch, so I get that that takes time. I just don't find it as compelling as Bond at the health clinic and all the Spectre stuff at the start. In a curious move, Bond decides to have sex with Domino and then immediately after tell her that her brother has been killed by the man whose boat she is currently living on. Oh, and by the way, that boat might be harbouring 2 stolen nuclear devices. Oh, and by the way, would you mind taking this Geiger counter and seeing if you can find any radiation on board? She has to process a lot of information very quickly, but I do like that we have Bond being fully aware and conscious of the danger he's putting this woman into, and he kind of resolves that in himself, and it's for the greater good, so gotta do it. Domino goes back to the ship, and Bond and Leiter board an American submarine, which chases the Disco Volante as the deadline for the ransom fast approaches. There's an undersea battle here between the 2 crews that doesn't actually take up that much page space as I expected, given how big a part of the film those particular sequences are, the underwater battles, and here on the book it's actually quite a brutal fight nonetheless. It comes down to Bond versus Largo, and Bond is really beaten quite badly here before Domino appears and shoots a spear at Largo, killing him. So the bombs are recovered and Bond and Domino head to hospital, and that's where we end Thunderball. I skipped over a lot of stuff in the second 2/3 of this book because the sequences that appealed to me were all the stuff in the first third with the health clinic and Spectre and all that, and then as soon as we get into the stuff about actually finding the nuclear bombs, meh, I'm kinda not so interested. I mean, there are some really ingenious villains plots in this series, but just stealing 2 nuclear bombs, holding the world to ransom, it's just so basic. I don't know, I mean, it's really high stakes, don't get me wrong, but it's just not terribly engaging for me, and I think when I do my final ranking of these books, Thunderball is gonna sit somewhere with Goldfinger. I mean, elements in both that I really enjoy, but just kinda okay? So, like I say, the most interesting thing for me in this story is Bond being sent to the clinic and all of the hijinks that go on at Shrublands. Bond certainly has more of a sense of humour in this story, and he's making quips and dry comments along the lines of what he was doing in Goldfinger. I really enjoyed Bond in this story, and personally I prefer that he's a bit of a lighter character in these later books. Certainly in the first 5 stories he was quite solemn, and don't get me wrong, I like that too, but for the kind of adventures that Fleming is trying to tell here, I think the lighter touch regarding the mood of Bond is better, because a lot of this stuff is really silly. It's great seeing Bond interact with Felix again, and they feel like such a pair of buddies at this point that I really enjoy all the stuff with them interacting. This is certainly my favourite pairing of those two characters in the book so far. I'm not sure that given the hook hand, Felix is the most inconspicuous of partners for a spy to have, but, you know, it's great that he's here, and it certainly doesn't stop him from joining in on the action. Domino I found to be one of the more interesting Fleming women in the book so far. I've said time and time again that I don't think Fleming can really write compelling female characters all that well. They often end up all just, like, sounding the same. I mean, Tiffany Case being a notable exception, and Domino shares some of her spunkiness, so maybe that's why she kind of works for me here. I thought that Largo was quite uncompelling, but serviceable. He's the main villain of this particular story, and I don't think it helps that he's only introduced after we have the wonderful chapter dedicated to Blofeld. I mean, interestingly here, Blofeld is Spectre's number 2 and Largo is number 1, but Blofeld is very much presented as the big bad of the organisation, and not since Red Grant has such a large amount of space been dedicated to just describing the villain in these books. He's so big and dominating, and so it's a bit of a pill to swallow when after this great build-up you learn that, no, this incredibly amazing description is not your main villain for this book, but rather that less impressive man over there. What is also interesting to me is that this seems like the first time that Fleming is very consciously planting seeds for future adventures. Knowing what I know about the book series, I know that there is the Blofeld trilogy, so I'm expecting this character to come back and have a larger role in some future Bond books, and that's great, because here he doesn't really play much of a role in the nitty-gritty action of the film. He's the mastermind of the whole plan, of course, no doubt. But honestly, after the introduction he gets in this book, I cannot wait to get to a book where he is the main villain and presumably runs throughout the whole story. So this book has obviously been adapted into 2 films, and both of those films are actually pretty faithful to the source material in their own ways, and interestingly both add in an extra villain in the form of Fiona Volpe and Fatima Blush, and I guess that's in order to give Bond some more conflict in the middle of the story. I feel that Domino was softened somewhat in both films too. In the book she has a hell of a lot more spunk and personality to her than the character in the movies, where I find her a little too soft. I really wish we'd seen Sean Connery and Bernard Lee in a more direct adaptation of those Bond M scenes from the start of the book on film, when M's in his health kick and everything. I love all that stuff. I would have loved to see Bernard Lee playing some of those scenes from the book. I find it very interesting how, on a separate note, I find it very interesting how the films will often tweak certain decisions and hunches and motivations to come from Bond instead of other characters. In this instance, of course, it's M who has the hunch about the Bahamas and so sends Bond, whereas in the film, it's Bond that has the hunch and follows up the investigation after convincing his superiors to allow him, which is interesting and a really smart move on the part of the filmmakers, because it helps make Bond a more active character in the investigation and the decision-making processes. In the book, he does just kind of feel like, oh well, this is my job, this is what my boss has told me to do, so I'm gonna do it. Thunderball started out really strong for me. As I keep saying, all the Health Club stuff, Blofeld, Spectre, Bond and M interacting, all top tier Fleming for me. The rest of the book, it's kind of fine. I mean, it's a perfectly serviceable James Bond adventure, much like Goldfinger was, and at this point it feels like we're very much into the formula of the Bond adventures, which is why I'm actually quite excited to be taking a breather of sorts for the next book in the series, The Spy Who Loved Me, which is something I'm told completely different, and I know limited details about that particular book, but I do know that Fleming himself was so displeased with the work that he had it written into the contract when he was signing away the film rights that only the title of that particular story could be used and no story elements could be adapted into a screen story. So I'm very curious to find out what Fleming was so displeased with about his own work, and if you are curious about that too, then please do join me next time. In the meantime, please do let me know your thoughts on Thunderball in the comments below, and please go down to the video description to find my Facebook page, my Twitter page, and my Patreon page if you wish to donate on there. And until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.